Well, it was mid-December in 2020 when I started a study of the American and slippery elms during the leafless season. And at the time I was looking at some larger trees and looking at bark and looking at leaf litter to distinguish them apart and from the other trees in the forest. Well, this is midsummer here at the Halls Creek Nature Preserve in Warren County, Ohio. And I'm going to resume the study of these elm trees during the leaf season, or the season where they have their foliage. I'll be making some clips in several different locations in this area over the next few days. So this is the start of this, and we'll continue on in several different parks. Got some world-famous limestone layers here with more fossils than you'd normally find in limestone at this park. And you don't need to call it fossil hunting because every rock has a fossil in it. You'd have a hard time finding a rock that doesn't. And growing along this stream, we've got some American elm with its... And we've got this bumpy bark on these smaller American elm trees. It can get kind of shaggy and unruly looking, as I showed in that winter video. And if we break a little piece off, we can see that cross section. It looks like a layered cookie. This one here is a little hard to see, but we'll look at that again in a few minutes. It's a real corky, lightweight bark. If you had to use it as a fishing bobber, it would work just fine. And there's quite a bit of it growing along this stream here. Let's just take a look at a little bit more of this bark before we look at the leaves. So these younger American elms can often have this corky bark. And as the tree gets larger, it usually loses that appearance. I think the layering is going to show up okay in that piece of bark that I broke off gently. So I'm not trying to harm the tree. We can just very gently pry a little bit of this corky bark off and see the obvious layers, brown and white layers. We're going to look at some larger trees that are parked nearby here, but let's look at the foliage of these American elms, and we've also got some slippery elms in the understory of this upland forest right up the hill here. And this particular tree is getting partial sun and partial shade. The size of the leaves on trees, many types of trees, depends on how much sun it's getting and how old the tree is and how fast it's growing. But this is probably what you would consider an average size leaf for an American elm tree. And you can see those veins are very, very parallel. And we'll put that dollar bill behind it for scale, and also so that the cameras will focus on what's in the front and not in the back of the view here. So yes, those veins run very parallel all the way out to the edge. It's got a toothed edge that's doubly toothed, so one tooth with smaller teeth between it. And you can feel a roughness. It's not extremely rough, but there is definitely a rough texture, but nowhere near as rough as that of the slippery elm. So don't let the name slippery elm confuse you. There's nothing slippery about the foliage of either one of these trees. One distinguishing characteristic about the elms is one side of the leaf is offset from the other at the base, and sometimes it's quite obvious. On these smaller leaves at the lower part of the tree, it's not too noticeable, but on some leaves that are getting more sun and that are growing larger, it's very obvious. So it's not quite the same on both sides. It's a little uneven. Let's go up the hill and take a look at some slippery elm leaves. And before we move on to the foliage of the slippery elm, I want to spend some time comparing this American elm foliage to that of an American beech, which is also a very common tree, probably even more common than the American elm. But the leaves have some similarities. Here's our American elm clipped to this American beech branch with its parallel veins and its doubly sawtoothed edge. And the American beech right to its left here has those parallel veins, but it only has a single sawtoothed edge. And of course the bark on these trees is much different. There would be no confusing that. But the leaves are similar enough. I want to do a quick comparison here, at least in the visual realm. Now if you touch the leaves, the American beech is very smooth on both sides. And the American elm is somewhat rough and hairy and coarse. And we've moved about a quarter mile up the hill, about 200 feet higher than that lower elevation where the parking lot is on this map. It's almost hard to see this map with the reflection. But where the parking lot is where that stream is and where the American elm was hugging the banks. And we're at the star here where the trail that comes up from the parking lot makes a loop originating at this star. So it's about a 1 mile loop plus about a quarter mile up the hill. So this is a nice morning or afternoon hike. It's not very long, but there's a lot of wildflowers and large variety of plants back here, and not a whole lot of invasives, at least not continuous invasives. The native plants still have a chance here. And in the understory of the woods up the hill from the creek, we're finding all kinds of slippery elm getting started here. And this is growing in full shade here. Has no trouble seeding itself in full shade here. So our leaf, when it's in full shade, does not have that uneven appearance at the base by very much. Just like that American elm, it is just a little bit longer on one side of the leaf than the other, but not enough to really tell it from the other leaves in the forest. You'd have to know your plants well to do that. But the touch or feel of this slippery elm leaf, you can hear that and you can certainly feel it. It's very coarse, almost like a 60 grit sandpaper. And I'd consider the American elm leaf to maybe be like a 120 grit sandpaper. If any of you woodworkers out there watching this, you'll know what I'm talking about. So in the overall shape, I can say on average that these slippery elm leaves are broadest at the middle with a pointed top, and the American elm, which I've got in front of it here, is broadest at the lower half of the leaf, but not in the middle. And I could also say on average that the teeth on this slippery elm, at least on the saplings, are larger and a little bit more uneven than that of the American elm. This one here especially has got real large teeth on it. There was some blowdown a few years ago that let one of these slippery elm saplings get established and grow much faster than the surrounding ones. So let's go take a look at that one. And as I've mentioned in many of my other videos, the emerald ash borer has killed off most of the larger ashes in these woods. Still can find plenty of saplings, but once they get to be 6-8 inches in diameter, the beetles make themselves at home and lay eggs in the bark, and you know the rest. So one proverb I read a long time ago said disaster and opportunity are spelled the same. And in the woods, that's definitely true. Because look at the size of the leaves on this slippery elm when it had a chance to get full sun. And again, these slippery elms are seeding themselves in throughout this trail. All along this trail you find them. And normally the leaves are 2 to 4 inches long, but when they get full sun, everything gets exaggerated, including the geometry here. Look at how the one side is much more offset than the other on these leaves. So in this case, the leaf in view here, the bottom half is definitely longer. You can do that on all these leaves here, really. One half is definitely longer than the other, and these leaves are almost 6 inches long when they're getting full sun and the tree is growing rapidly and aggressively. So this slippery elm is found on fence rows and along roadsides. I find it quite often as I'm driving around. I see it when it's in bloom. It stands out especially in early spring. Summertime, it kind of blends in, but in late March, early April, when it's in bloom and when the fruits are on the branches, it's real easy to tell as you're driving along. And so it likes to get some partial to full sun, but it is seeding itself in the understory of this beech maple forest and growing aggressively when the opportunities open up from blowdowns and trees that are diseased by the emerald ash borer. So and we'll just continue on here at a ground level where we can get a better look at these leaves. So this is from that branch we just looked at, folks, and in this case the right side is definitely longer and more offset at the base of the stem or petiole than the left side. So that's one distinguishing characteristic on the elms. It's just not always too obvious if the leaves are small or in deep shade. But look at the size of this guy that was getting full sun. He's as large as that dollar bill. He's probably 6 inches long. And that American elm from down along the stream is only half as long. We're going to go look at some larger and mature trees, go back to looking at the bark, and look at some more foliage at a park nearby here. And we've moved about 7 or 8 miles up the Little Miami River Valley here to a different park. This is the lower slopes at the Fort Ancient State Memorial. I've made many of the videos on this channel, on this trail and the surrounding trails. Fort Ancient State Memorial has hundreds of acres of well-preserved woodlands, as well as prehistoric mounds from the Hopewell culture. Here we got about a 6-inch diameter American elm tree. Again, this is a little bit of this unruly or corky bark, but they don't all have this. We're going to go right up the trail and see one of the same size that does not. And just a gentle pry of a small chunk of bark, and there's our distinguishing feature on the bark of the American elm. That dark and light appearance. Looks like a cookie or even a Kit Kat candy bar in its appearance. Leaves are a little bit out of view on this tree. Let's go right up the trail. We'll pause for just a second. We've come just a couple hundred feet from that tree, the start of this video clip, and there's a similarly sized American elm without that unruly bark. It still has an obvious texture of small squares and different shaped polygons on the bark, but not as I call it unruly, but just, you know, corky and chunky. You can see those leaves just coming into view here. And those are about the same size and shape as the ones I showed a few minutes ago. And of course, often there's vines growing up these trees. Here we've got Virginia creeper growing up the tree with its 5 leaves. And poison ivy would have 3, so always be careful of your hazards here. The Virginia creeper is not toxic, but the poison ivy is. Some people more than others are allergic to it. There's a nice American elm here, making it real easy on us because it has the bark in view. Again, this bark is a lot smoother than that other tree. Has these little polygons and the leaves coming out of the trunk. So those leaves were pretty much in deep shade right here. They're not very large at all, maybe 2 inches long, about the size of the top half of my forefinger there. So the size and shape of a leaf, it depends a lot on how much sun it's getting. One side is slightly longer than the other, but it's more the texture, that slightly rough texture, and the bark itself that helps distinguish the American elm from some of the other trees that have leaves that look similar. Got lots of slippery elm in this chunk of woods too. Let's stop for a minute and take a look at that. And one identifying character I used last winter on these slippery elm trees was the color of the leaf litter, which you can't really tell this time of year. There's a lot of ground cover. I think this is mostly water leaf growing in here. Fortunately, we're far enough back from the river. There's not a lot of stinging nettles on this stretch of trail. But it makes it hard to see that leaf litter. But another characteristic of these slippery elm trees is the bark has furrows that run parallel to each other for long distances before they converge. So these furrows here run apart for a good 2 feet sometimes before they converge. So the furrows run parallel and they don't bump into each other that often, and this tree is making it easy to prove itself is a slippery elm and not a tree with similar bark, because it has a few leaves coming out of the trunk here, even though this is in full shade here and well down below where the main action is going on as far as the leaves and the branches with leaves. It's not uncommon to find these larger trees with some sprouts coming out the side with that really rough texture and the geometry of the leaf like I showed on some of the other examples. Let's pause for a minute. We're going to look at some slippery elm trees that do not have leaves on the bottom. But now that we've seen what the bark looks like, we can study them and use the leaves from this tree to help us learn what a tree would look like without those. And just for comparison, here's that American elm we looked at a few minutes ago. And right back off the trail here is a really nice big slippery elm. And they're not getting a whole lot bigger than this around here because of the Dutch elm disease and the fact that they get maybe 2 feet around at the most, and then usually they turn into skeletons of slippery elm. Got beautiful pawpaw in the understory of this bottomland forest, and some Ohio buckeye as well, but no slippery elm seedlings coming up here at all, unlike what we found in that other park at Halls Creek. There isn't a one to be found in the bottomland forest here in the understory. But here's a large slippery elm, at least large for this area. Again, with those furrows that don't bump into each other that often. And it's a fairly straight tree. They grow fairly straight and fairly tall and reach for the sky like some of the other trees in this bottomland. Let's go take a look at some other trees with bark that's of similar color and texture. And here's another slippery elm about 1 foot in diameter. And again, these furrows go long distances without converging. It's a medium brown color. And right up the trail here, some of the trees I used in my tulip poplar ID video a few months ago have a similar color, but the furrows converge on a regular basis. Every few inches, these guys bump into each other. But they grow very straight, just like the slippery elm. So that alone, the straightness is not enough. We need to look at the furrows and, of course, the leaves when they're visible. Got a really large tulip poplar over here that would be larger than most of the slippery elms we're finding in this park. As the tree gets larger, the furrows go longer distances without converging, but they do converge regularly. So that's one way you can tell them apart. We've got a slippery elm that is lost its bark right up the trail here. Let's pause for just a second. And the name slippery elm is based on the fact that the inner bark is very slippery. If you were to peel some off the tree, it's a very slippery, slimy, almost, I think that the textbook word is based on the word mucus, so kind of a slimy substance on the inside of the bark. I don't know if that's the reason why the whole tree loses its bark when it dies, but it does. These slippery elm trees, when they die, lose all their bark, and it piles up at the bottom of the tree. You can see the long furrows still remaining in this pile of bark that fell off this tree, and it lost every chunk of bark off this guy. There's not one piece left. I don't know of any other tree that consistently loses all of its bark before the tree falls down. So that's how you can tell these slippery elm trees when they're dead from the other trees in the forest. And for the mushroom hunters, that might be a good way of knowing where the mushrooms are to be found, because there's a strong correlation between elm trees in the forest, dead elm trees in the forest, and places where you can find morel mushrooms. So we'll stop for just a minute. We're going to look at some leaves that could mimic or be confused with the slippery elm and American elm trees. And in my field of view right now, it's about a 3-inch diameter American elm. The bark isn't terribly unruly on this one. It's a little bit corky in places. And there's that leaf we've become familiar with during this video series. Looks like the insects have had their way with these. Right up the trail here, just 2 or 3 feet actually, is a tree that used to be in the same botanical family as the elms. And this is the hackberry, the American hackberry, and has some very similar character traits. It's no longer in that family. I'll let my botanist friends weigh in on the reasons for that. But it does have some very obvious visual similarities. Here's our hackberry with the bumpier bark in places on this sapling, about the same size. And the leaves resemble that of the American elm, but if you notice, they're much longer than they are wide. Consistently longer than they are wide. But do have that offset bottom, or one side is a little longer than the other, sometimes quite a bit longer than the other side. So if we look carefully, the American elm tree leaf is clipped to this hackberry branch, and the leaf directly under the clothespin is the American elm with its slightly offset bottom, and maybe twice as long as it is wide. And our hackberry leaf has that offset bottom as well, a little more gracefully offset, and probably 3 times as long as it is wide. And the teeth on this hackberry, get them to come into focus here, are very evenly toothed, and the American elm can be evenly toothed, but it tends to be a little more jagged in appearance. And the veins on that American elm resemble that of the American beech, very parallel. And the veins on this hackberry are a little more, they're not quite as parallel, they're not as quite as close together. So there's some subtle differences. The feel is very similar though. They both have like a 120 grit sandpaper feel. So there are some very close similarities in these trees, and to the trained eye, you can't tell them apart. And about halfway up the hill here at Fort Ancient State Memorial, where this hillside in late July is covered in the flowers of wild ramps, which the foliage is one of the first things to turn green and emerge in early spring. And the flowers come up at a different time of the summer when the leaves have all died back. Let's take a look at one more tree to compare with our elms, and then we're going to put the wraps on this study. Parallel grooves, furrows and ridges that don't converge too often. This could be confused with the slippery elm, but this is the American basswood growing on this hillside. And can't say I have any slippery elm growing right next to it, but they grow in this same area. And along the river there, I've seen both within a stone's throw of each other. So let's do a quick comparison of the leaves of these trees. And if there's any doubt, you can use other methods as well. My thumb is on the leaf of the American basswood with its heart shape, and one side is usually a little longer than the other, often is longer than the other. You can see on this one right here, and this one right here. It has a jagged edge, and underneath the clothespin is the jagged edge of our slippery elm. So, and this slippery elm was getting full sun, and it's got that heart-shaped bottom as well. So a slippery elm, if it's getting full sun, can get the similar appearance as this American basswood. And the bark has some similarities. One thing that is not similar is the touch. This basswood leaf is smooth to the touch on both sides. So if you have any doubt about what kind of tree you're looking at, if you have the leaves available, you've got a much smoother touch on these basswood leaves than the rough feel of the not so slippery elm. So there's nothing slippery about the leaves. That's 60 grit sandpaper. So that's the difference, but they do have a similar appearance, and the bark has a similar appearance. So we'll include that in this lesson and put the wraps on this lesson of the American and slippery elms during the growing season.